Tyree King, Nicholas Glenn, Terrence Crutcher, Dahir Adan, Keith Scott. Those are the names of the Black Americans who have been killed by police since the last time I posted an Off Monday Ramble video, which was on September 12th. As I sit here recording this, it is September 23, and when this video is published, it will be September 26. That is 5 people, 5 Black Americans who have been killed by police in less than 2 weeks. It should be noted that 2 of those, Nicholas Glenn and Dahir Adan, were in the middle of committing horrible crimes when they were shot by police. Nicholas Glenn was in the middle of a shooting spree, and Dahir Adan was in the middle of a stabbing spree when they were killed by police. I still think the ideal is to apprehend criminals alive, even criminals who are in the midst of doing something awful. That's why we have due process and a judicial system, because we're not meant to be killing criminals on the street without due process and a trial. But nonetheless, I think those 2 deserve to be considered somewhat differently than the other 3 who were killed either unarmed, or whether or not they were armed is currently in dispute. And again, their names are Tyree King, who was 13 years old, Terrence Crutcher, and Keith Scott. And it was the killing of Keith Scott which compelled people in Charlotte, North Carolina to take to the streets and protest in response to his killing, which took place on September 20th. This sort of thing is just another part of American life that I fear we've gotten used to. We've become accustomed to hearing stories of police killing civilians. We've especially become accustomed to stories of police killing Black civilians. And it's just become another part of life. We're starting to treat it like a norm. We're starting to treat it like a natural state. But I don't want to spend most of this video talking about the deaths, the killings of Keith Scott or Terrence Crutcher or Tyree King. I want to actually spend most of this video talking about something that happened much closer to where I live, much closer to home. And it was an incident that took place last week in Hagerstown, which is where I lived for many years. It's a place that I consider to be a hometown of mine. It's where I was born. It's where I lived for several years in my early 20s. It's actually the first place I lived independent of my family. And it's a place that I've mentioned quite often in these videos that I do. And Hagerstown Police last week were involved in an incident with a 15-year-old girl. And the links to all the details are in the description of this video. I will link you to a Herald Mail newspaper article about the incident. I will link you to a cell phone video that was recorded of the incident from bystanders, and I will also link you to the police body cam footage from the Hagerstown PD that was released subsequently. And I will also link you to the press conference, which was held a few days later by the Hagerstown Police Department, where the chief of the Hagerstown Police Department describes the event to the media. I'll let you watch all that for yourself. You can come to your own conclusions. When you watch the footage, when you read up on what happened, it is not nearly as bad as what happened to Tyree King, for instance. This 15-year-old girl was not, as far as we know, was not permanently injured by her encounter with the police. She was not killed. And I suppose, given the state of things in this country, we should look on that as a silver lining. Let's look on the bright side. At least the police didn't murder her. But when you watch that footage, when you watch both the cell phone video taken from an objective standpoint and the body cam footage that was taken by officers that were there on the scene, what you see if you see it the same way I see it, what you see is kind of horrifying and indicative of the underlying problem. The fatal shootings of black folks at the hands of American police are just one facet of a much broader and much deeper problem that affects the way cops interact with civilians at all levels and in all types of encounters, whether those encounters turn violent or not. At his press conference, the chief of the Hagerstown Police claimed that the officers involved did nothing wrong. They all acted according to policy. And he even said that, they were trying to de-escalate the situation. You watch that video and you can see the officers trying to de-escalate the situation. I, again, invite you to watch the footage of what happened with this 15-year-old girl in Hagerstown. She was on her bike and she rode her bike out into the street, disobeying a traffic signal. She should not have gone into the street with her bike when she did. And she broke a traffic law and she hit a car. So legally, she was at fault for the collision between her bike and herself and the car. But she was knocked off her bike as a result of the collision, and reportedly she was knocked unconscious for about 30 seconds. And when she came to, she was disoriented, she was scared. It was found later, a small amount of marijuana on her. She was afraid she would get caught by the cops for having pot. She was afraid that her parents would find out. This young woman, by the way, is biracial. Her parents are, her mother is a white woman, her father is a black man, so she is biracial, but she would most likely be perceived by most people as black. All of the police officers who responded to the scene were white. And this young lady was very agitated, very upset, obviously very afraid. She tried to get on her bike and leave the scene of the accident when the officers were there. And it was at that point that it became a confrontation, and it turned, to my eyes, very distressingly violent. The officers pulled her off her bike. They tried to hold her down. They tried to hold her against a wall. The family's attorney claims that she was slammed into a wall by the police. It's difficult to tell whether or not that happened by the body cam footage, because by the time they're struggling with her and putting her up against the wall, they're very close. Of course, the body cam footage is sort of dark and sort of blurry and hard to make out. It's difficult to tell if she was slammed into the wall or if she was just sort of pushed into the wall. But either way, you have this 15-year-old child being descended on and manhandled by multiple large, fully grown male police officers. She's handcuffed. She sits down on the sidewalk where one of the officers puts his hand on her shoulder to keep her from getting up. And throughout this ordeal, this girl is screaming and hollering and resisting, and the officers are doing what the Hagerstown police chief later described in his press conference as trying to de-escalate the situation. For the third time, I invite you to watch this footage, and I ask you, find me where these officers at any point during this ordeal try to de-escalate things with this girl. What the police chief of Hagerstown describes in his press conference is the officer who was closest to her during the initial physical struggle telling her, actually, the police chief says he was asking her to stop, and he compliments the officer for his behavior in this confrontation. He says, the officer you see in the body cam footage, the officer repeatedly is asking her to stop. What he's referring to is this officer saying to this young child as she is struggling and terrified, stop, 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 over and over again for about a minute. Just stop. When you say stop to someone in that tone of voice, and they're a 100-pound 15-year-old girl and you're a 200-pound armed male police officer, you're not asking them to do anything. Nobody asked that girl to do anything in those videos. She was never asked to do anything. She was ordered to comply. And when she struggled and resisted and did not comply, she was subjected to greater levels of force. There was never a moment in that video where one of those officers tries to calm things down, where one of those officers tries to make himself that girl's friend, where one of those officers acknowledges that she is alone and she's surrounded by cops and she's terrified. There is never any acknowledgement of the needs, of the concerns, of the feelings of this girl by any of those officers that you can see in that body cam footage. All you see are repeated demands that she obey them. And when she doesn't obey them, they apply force. That's not de-escalation. Nobody tried to befriend that girl. Nobody tried to calm her down. Nobody showed any gentleness or understanding to that 15-year-old girl that I saw. What they did was they handcuffed her. Eventually, they decided they were going to put her in the squad car. It was rationalized later that the reason why they refused to let her go, one of the reasons they refused to let her go, was that she had been in an accident and knocked unconscious, and they feared for her health, and they wanted to make sure that she didn't leave before her parents could arrive so her parents could decide whether or not she should receive medical attention. What they ended up doing was handcuffing her, throwing her in the squad car, and taking her to the police station. They did not take her to the hospital. They did not see to it while she was in their care that she received medical attention, even though supposedly, after the fact, they were so concerned about her physical well-being. What they did was they put her in the back of the squad car, and when she continued to resist and didn't pull her legs into the car when they wanted her to, they pepper sprayed her. They sprayed her in the face with pepper spray while she was in a squad car that was essentially closed. They tried to close the doors close as far as they could, and then they pepper sprayed her through a crack in the window, and then they closed her into the car. So this 15-year-old girl who had been manhandled by police and was terrified was then basically pushed into a closed police car and pepper sprayed in the face. Again, the Hagerstown Police chief insists they did nothing wrong. They acted according to policy. If you do decide to watch those videos and read the Herald Mail article, if you can stomach it, take a glance at the comments and notice how many people are saying that this 15-year-old girl deserved to be treated the way she was treated. Look at how many comments are saying, well, she was a brat. She was disobeying the officers. She was being disrespectful. She deserved what happened to her. Those officers were using restraint. In fact, the Hagerstown Police chief made that point several times. He made it a point to say several times during the press conference that the officers were all over 200 pounds. And they acted with such admirable restraint against this young lady, as though we should be grateful that these men did not batter her worse or kill her, as though we should be grateful to these cops who terrified and manhandled and pepper sprayed this young girl, that they didn't do worse to her. How twisted is that mentality? How sick is it that a police chief, responding to an incident where his officers manhandle a young girl, asks us to be proud of them because they didn't kill her, asks us to admire their restraint, to take note of how much bigger they were than her, and to say, look at the restraint they used when they pushed her against the wall and handcuffed her and held her down and forced her into the back of a squad car and pepper sprayed her. Look at the restraint that they used. Look at how well they handled it, this unruly child. This is a 15-year-old girl who, again, would be perceived by most people as being black, who was surrounded by police, without her family there, in a city, Hagerstown, that is a racist city. Trust me on this if you've not been there. It is a racist city that exists in a racist country where on an almost daily basis there are stories on the news of police officers, often white police officers, having encounters with civilians, often black civilians. Sometimes, even as we saw in the case of Tyree King, young children or teenagers, where the encounter ends with the death of the black person at the hands of the police officer. And in all but an extremely, extremely small number of cases, the police officer faces no punishment, no consequences for killing this black person. This is the country, this is the context in which this 15-year-old girl in Hagerstown lives. I wonder why she was so afraid of those officers. I wonder why she was so urgently trying to escape. And I think about those people in Charlotte taking to the streets, protesting, rioting, enraged at the death of yet another black person at the hands of police, enraged at the killing of Keith Scott. And I ask myself, why shouldn't they riot? What reason do they have to trust the system? What reason do they have to trust that when police arrive on the scene that they will be treated fairly? The Massachusetts State Supreme Court just ruled that running from the police cannot be used in and of itself to establish suspicion and to justify being pursued or being subjected to force by the police. Because the Massachusetts Supreme Court recognized that police in Massachusetts have such a well-established history of racial discrimination and racial bias that it's reasonable for a black person in Massachusetts to see cops and to turn and run away. That's the country that we live in. And that phenomenon is in no way limited to the state of Massachusetts. That's the country that we live in. That's the country that this 15-year-old girl in Hagerstown lives in. I don't wonder why people are taking to the streets over this. I don't wonder why people are rioting over this issue. I wonder how long we as a culture, as a society, are going to leave them no choice but to riot. I wonder how long they will have to riot. They will have to resort to violence and taking to the streets before we start actually paying attention to what they're trying to tell the rest of us. And we actually join with them and stand with them in solidarity. White, black, whatever ethnicity you might be, men, women, civilian, police, everybody, standing alongside one another and saying this has to stop. This systemic prejudice and racist brutalization of Americans at the hands of police has to stop. We have to recognize that this is a real problem and we have to do something about it. And if that means we have to tear down the entire theory of police in this country and rebuild it from the ground up into something that is not as warped and broken and twisted and sick as it evidently is now, then that's just what the fuck we have to do. But how many more Charlottes is it going to take? How many more Fergusons? How many more Dallases? How many more Baltimores? How many more New Yorks is it going to take? And how many more black Americans who are lucky to escape with their lives will nonetheless be brutalized and terrorized by police, like the 15-year-old girl in Hagerstown last week, before the rest of us realize that this is a problem that needs to be taken seriously, and then, God damn it, we start taking it seriously and do something about it. Hey folks, hope you enjoyed this one, if that's the right word I want to use for this video. If you did, please like, share, and subscribe, and also please consider helping me to make more videos like this one by supporting this channel through Patreon. You can go to patreon.com/Steve Shives to become a patron. Thanks for watching.